The night was quiet. Too quiet. John Wick sat alone in the corner of his dimly lit room. No sounds of laughter, no voice calling his name. Only silence that pressed against his chest like a weight he could no longer carry. On the small wooden table in front of him lay two things, a silver ring and a faded photograph. The ring still carried the warmth of a touch that was gone, and the photograph, her smile, frozen in time, staring back at him as if she never left. He held the ring gently, almost afraid it might slip through his fingers and vanish, just as she had. His hand trembled, but not from fear, from the unbearable truth that this was all he had left of the woman he loved more than life itself. John Wick, the man the world feared. The name whispered with terror. Tonight, he was not a legend, not a shadow, not even a fighter. He was just a man who had loved once and lost everything. The walls of the house echoed with memories. Every corner reminded him of her voice, her laughter, her footsteps moving softly in the hall. Now those echoes were ghosts, haunting him, reminding him of a life he could never touch again. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. People saw him as unstoppable, unbreakable, but only he knew how fragile he truly was without her. Because beneath the steel and the scars, there was a promise that still burned inside him like a fire that refused to die. His lips pressed against the ring, his voice breaking in a whisper. "I remember, I haven't forgotten." A tear rolled down his cheek, carving a path through the silence, and then the narrator's voice cuts in. "Some promises outlive the people we make them to. Some vows keep us alive, even when our hearts are breaking." This was the last promise John Wick ever made to his wife. A promise that would define the man, the legend, and the pain he could never escape. The screen fades to black, her photograph still glowing in the dim light. Cliffhanger for next part. But what exactly was that promise? And why did it haunt him every single day? The hospital smelled of antiseptic and sorrow. Dim lights flickered against pale white walls, and the steady beep, beep, beep of the heart monitor was the only rhythm in the room. Outside, the world carried on with its noise and chaos. But inside, time itself seemed to hold its breath. John Wick sat at her bedside, his eyes hollow yet filled with an ocean of fear he could not show. His wife lay weak against the pillow, her skin pale, her breathing slow, each breath a fragile thread connecting her to life. He held her hand as though letting go would mean losing her forever. For years, he had faced bullets, blood, and betrayal without flinching. But tonight he was powerless. No weapon, no skill, no shadow of his legend could protect her from the truth pressing down on them both. Death was near, and John Wick could not fight it. Her lips trembled, her voice barely more than a whisper. "John," he leaned closer, his heart pounding. "I'm here. I'm right here." Her eyes, though weak, still carried the light that had once pulled him out of darkness. "You've always been strong, stronger than anyone I've known. But strength isn't what I want you to promise me tonight." He tightened his grip on her hand. His throat was dry. "What do you mean?" A small, almost invisible smile touched her lips. "Promise me one thing. Something only you can keep." The words hung in the air, heavier than any vow he had ever made. For a moment he couldn't answer. He wanted to tell her not to speak, to save her strength, to fight for one more breath, one more moment. But he knew this was the moment she had chosen. Her hand trembled as she brushed his cheek, her touch as soft as the memory of spring. "The world will try to take everything from you. It will test you, it will push you to hate, to close your heart. John, promise me you won't let it. Promise me you'll keep your heart alive. Promise me you'll still find reasons to love." Tears blurred his vision, but he forced a broken nod. I promise." Her breathing grew slower, her eyes closing gently as though she had finally laid down a burden she had carried for years. That faint smile never left her face, the smile of a woman who trusted him with more than her life. John bent his forehead to her hand, his tears spilling freely now. The monitor beeped slower, slower, until silence filled the room. The man who had conquered the underworld was now just a widower, cradling the hand of the woman he could not save. And in that silence, Her words echoed louder than any gunshot. "Promise me, don't let your heart turn cold." The world outside moved as if nothing had changed. Cars passed. People laughed. The city lights still glowed against the night sky. But for John Wick, time had stopped the moment her eyes closed. The hospital room was silent now, except for the low hum of machines and the fading echo of the monitor that had gone flat. John didn't move. His body trembled, but his hands refused to release hers. It was as if letting go meant surrendering her memory to the cold air around him. The nurses entered quietly, their footsteps soft, their faces filled with sympathy. They knew who he was, yet in this room, he wasn't the legendary name whispered in fear. He was simply a man, broken, clutching the hand of the woman who had been his anchor. One of the nurses gently whispered, "Sir, we need—" John cut her off with a quiet, hollow voice. "Just one more minute." And so they left him there alone with her. He stared at her face, memorizing every detail, the curve of her lips, the way her hair fell gently across her forehead, the stillness that replaced her laughter. He wished he could freeze this moment, not the one of her death, but of her peace. For even in her final breath she had smiled. That smile, and those words, "Promise me you'll keep your heart alive." The words sank into him like a blade. She had asked for something far harder than vengeance, harder than survival. She had asked him to stay human in a world that wanted him to be nothing but a weapon. He whispered again, almost pleading with her spirit. "I don't know if I can, but I swear I'll try." His tears fell on her hand, and for a moment he imagined she could still feel them, still hear him. The days that followed blurred together. The house felt emptier than ever before. Every room was a graveyard of memories. The kitchen where she used to hum softly while cooking, the chair where she curled up with a book, the balcony where they once stood watching sunsets together. Each place carried the echo of her presence, but also the crushing reminder of her absence. John would sit for hours in silence, holding her photograph, repeating the promise he made, as if saying it enough times would make it easier to bear. But it didn't. Instead, it grew heavier, because the world outside did not care about his grief. It demanded his attention, his presence, his return. And slowly, he realized that this promise wasn't just a memory. It was a war inside himself. Every instinct in him screamed to shut down, to bury his pain beneath walls of anger, to let his heart turn to stone so nothing could hurt him again. But every time he felt himself falling into that abyss, he heard her voice, gentle, fragile, yet powerful enough to pull him back. "Don't let your heart turn cold." The words haunted him. They followed him in dreams, in silence, even in the reflection of his own eyes in the mirror. And so, John Wick, the man who could kill with precision, who could survive impossible battles, found himself facing the hardest enemy of all, himself. The nights were the hardest. The city outside never slept. Horns, lights, footsteps, endless movement. But inside John Wick's home, silence stretched like an ocean, drowning him deeper with every passing hour. He would sit in the living room for hours, surrounded by shadows. The lamp in the corner barely lit the room, leaving most of it swallowed in darkness. On the table lay her photograph, her ring, and a half-empty glass of whiskey he never touched. He would pour it, lift it, stare into it, but something always stopped him, because he remembered her words. "Don't let your heart turn cold." Yet the silence tempted him. It whispered, "Give in. Numb the pain, forget." One night the weight of his grief became unbearable. He stood suddenly, the chair scraping across the floor. His chest heaved, his fists clenched. He could feel the anger rising, the kind of anger that once made the underworld tremble. His hand slammed against the table, sending the glass shattering to the ground. The whiskey spread across the floor like spilled blood. He stared at it for a long time, breathing heavily, trembling between rage and despair. His eyes fell on the drawer nearby, the one where he kept a weapon. Instinct told him to open it, to feel the weight of steel in his hands, to let violence give him the illusion of control. Slowly, he reached for it. His fingers brushed against the handle. The silence in the room thickened. His reflection in the dark window stared back at him. Hollow eyes, a man on the edge of collapse, and then her voice echoed in his mind again. "Promise me. You'll keep your heart alive." John froze. His hand shook against the drawer. He squeezed his eyes shut, and for a moment he could almost feel her hand resting on his cheek, just as it had on that final night. He pulled his hand back sharply, collapsing into the chair. His body trembled, his face buried in his palms. A sob escaped his lips, raw, broken, unrecognizable from the legend the world feared. Days turned into weeks, but the struggle never left him. He would walk through the streets of the city, hood pulled low, trying to disappear into the crowd. People brushed past him, strangers with their own lives, their own noise. Some looked at him with irritation, some with indifference. Once a man bumped into him and muttered under his breath, "Watch where you're going, old man." Old man. The words stung more than they should have. Once no one would have dared speak to him like that. Once his very name had been enough to silence a room. But now he was invisible. Part of him wanted to turn, to remind the man who he was. But another part whispered, "That's not who you promised to be." So he walked on, silent, contained. The city had a cruel way of testing men who carried pain. For John Wick, every step outside his door felt like walking into an ambush, not of bullets or knives, but of memories, temptations, and people who could not see the storm he carried inside. One late afternoon, John wandered into a small cafe. He had avoided places like this since her passing, because everything reminded him of her, the way she loved coffee, the way she smiled at strangers, the way she said, "Kindness is free." John, don't forget that. The cafe was crowded, students scribbling notes, a businessman speaking too loudly on his phone, an elderly woman sipping tea in silence. John quietly took a corner seat, his hood still pulled low, hoping to disappear. But the world rarely let him. A young man at the next table, impatient and arrogant, slammed his cup down. Some coffee spilled onto John's sleeve. The boy scoffed without apology. "Watch it, old man," he muttered. John looked at him. Just one glance. The boy's words carried the same sting as the stranger on the street days before. For a heartbeat, the old instinct surged. His mind calculated angles, reactions, how quickly he could silence this disrespect. But then a whisper returned to him. "Promise me. You'll keep your heart alive." John exhaled slowly, forcing his hands to relax. He picked up a napkin, wiped the sleeve, and said nothing. The young man laughed, mistaking restraint for weakness. But John knew better. True strength wasn't in the strike he held back. It was in the promise he refused to break. As he left the cafe, rain began to fall. The streets glistened, neon signs reflected on the wet pavement. John walked aimlessly until he found himself outside a small bookstore. Something about it drew him in. Inside, the scent of old pages wrapped around him. Shelves stood tall, filled with forgotten voices. He wandered through them until his hand brushed against a familiar cover, a book his wife once read aloud to him, her voice soft in the quiet of their home. He opened it, and between the pages was a note, not his, not hers, but a stranger's scribble. "To whoever finds this, be gentle with yourself. The world is hard enough already." John's throat tightened. He stood still, staring at the words. It felt like another reminder, another anchor pulling him back whenever grief tried to drag him under. But the test of a promise does not only come from strangers or fate. Sometimes it comes from the ghosts of the past. One evening, as John returned home, he noticed a black car parked across the street. Tinted windows, engine off, watching. He knew that silence. He knew that kind of waiting. The underworld he had left behind had not forgotten him. And now they seemed to be circling again, like vultures sensing weakness. Two men stepped out of the car, not armed visibly, but their movements were sharp, deliberate. They approached him with mocking smiles. "John Wick," one of them said, stretching the name like a challenge. "Didn't think we'd find you living like this. What happened to the Baba Yaga?" The second man chuckled. "Look at him, soft, broken. Maybe the stories were just myths after all." The old fire surged in John's chest. His muscles tensed, his senses sharpened. In an instant, he knew he could end this conversation with silence and violence. But then he remembered. The last night, her hand in his, her voice trembling but steady. "Promise me, John, no matter what the world takes from you, don't lose your heart." He took a slow breath. His gaze was steady, but his voice calm. "You should leave," he said quietly. The men smirked. One stepped closer. "Or what?" John's silence was heavier than any threat. His eyes, calm, unflinching, carried a weight the men couldn't quite mock. After a tense pause, they exchanged glances, muttered something under their breath, and returned to the car. John stood there in the rain, watching the car disappear into the night. His fists were still clenched, but his promise was unbroken. That night, sitting alone again, John realized something profound. His wife's last words weren't just a request, they were a shield. Every time the world tried to drag him back into the darkness, her voice pulled him toward the light. And yet, he knew this was only the beginning, because promises are never safe. They are tested again and again, until either they break, or the man keeping them does. The night was heavy with rain, the kind that blurred streets into rivers and turned neon lights into bleeding colors. John Wick walked slowly through the storm, every drop striking his face like a reminder he was still alive. But survival meant nothing if he couldn't keep the one thing that mattered, his promise. Her voice echoed again, clear despite the roar of thunder. "Promise me, John. Keep your heart alive. Don't let the world take it from you." He repeated it in his mind like a prayer, but fate seemed determined to test the strength of his vow. That evening, as John returned to his quiet home, the air felt wrong. A silence lingered, not the peace of solitude, but the sharp edge of being watched. The door creaked open. Inside, the living room lamp glowed faintly. And there, sitting casually in his chair, was a man John thought he would never see again, a figure from the old world, a handler. The man smiled thinly. "John Wick, the world misses you." John's jaw tightened. "I'm not coming back," the handler chuckled, leaning forward. "You think you can hide behind grief? You think you can bury what you are? No, John, men like you don't get peace. Men like you are peace for no one." John said nothing. His silence was an iron wall. The man slid an envelope across the table. "Someone came to us. Someone who believes only you can save them. They're innocent, John, and if you walk away, their blood will be on your hands." John stared at the envelope but didn't touch it. His chest tightened. The promise weighed heavier than ever. His wife had wanted him to keep love alive, to stay human, not to fall back into the shadows. But what was love if he ignored the cry of someone helpless? That night, John didn't sleep. He sat at the edge of his bed, the rain whispering against the window. His mind tore in two directions. If he helped, he risked stepping back into the world he had left, violence, death, and the cycle his wife had begged him to escape. If he refused, he would live with the guilt of breaking something even deeper, the compassion she had wanted him to preserve. The promise wasn't just about avoiding violence. It was about keeping his heart alive. And sometimes a heart cannot stay alive by doing nothing. The next morning, John found himself at a bus stop on the far side of the city, envelope in hand. The rain had stopped, leaving the air sharp and cold. He opened it. Inside was a photograph. A young girl, barely 12, eyes wide with fear. A note beneath it read, "She has no one else. They will come for her tonight." John closed his eyes, his breath heavy. He saw his wife again, her fragile smile in that hospital bed, her voice trembling but strong. "Promise me you'll still find reasons to love." His hand clenched around the photograph. He understood now. Love was not always about holding on to someone you had lost. Sometimes it was about protecting those still left in the world. By nightfall, John stood outside an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The girl was inside, held by men who only understood cruelty. Shadows moved in the windows. Laughter echoed faintly. John Wick exhaled, slow and steady. He had spent weeks, months restraining himself, fighting the pull of violence. But tonight, his wife's promise wasn't holding him back. It was guiding him forward, This wasn't vengeance. This wasn't rage. This was love in another form. Inside, chaos unfolded quickly. The men had heard stories of John Wick, but they didn't believe legends. Not until the legends stood in the doorway, silent and unflinching. The fight was brutal, inevitable. Chairs shattered, bodies fell. The storm inside John, held back for so long, now moved with purpose, not for himself, not for vengeance, but for the life of a girl who deserved the future his wife had once dreamed of for them. Minutes later, silence filled the warehouse. Only John and the girl remained. She looked at him with trembling fear. He bent down, his voice low, gentle. "You're safe now." The girl hesitated, then clung to him. John froze for a moment, then slowly wrapped his arm around her. And in that fragile embrace, he felt it, the echo of his wife's promise, alive within him as he walked her out into the cold night, the city lights stretching endlessly ahead. John Wick understood something deeper than he ever had before. His wife's last words weren't meant to chain him away from the world. They were meant to remind him how to move through it, with love, not hate, with purpose, not vengeance. And though the path ahead was uncertain, one truth was clear. He had kept his promise.